Right, continuing on from my discussion of Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness. One of the central structural elements of the thought self is facticity. The thought self apprehends itself as a lack or decompression of being. It is not its own foundation. It is a hole in the heart of being, infected with nothingness, abandoned to a world without justification. It discovers itself thrown into a situation, buffeted by brute contingencies, for the most part superfluous and in the way. Facticity indicates the utter contingency and irrevocable situationality of the being of the thought self. Without facticity, consciousness could choose its attachments to the world. It would be absolute and unfettered freedom. But the freedom which the thought self experiences is always restricted by the situation in which it is abandoned. Nevertheless, the freedom of the thought self is a real freedom, and even in its facticity, the thought self perpetually relates itself to itself in freedom. As Sartre would give as an example, I do not choose to become, or rather, I do not become a bourgeois or Frenchman until I choose to become such. Although who would want to choose to be a Frenchman? No, I jest. Anyway, freedom is always present, translating facticity into possibility. In the final analysis, the thought self is totally responsible for its being. Value and possibility provide two additional structures for the thought self. Value is an expression of an impossible striving toward a coincidence of being. The thought self perpetually strives to surpass itself toward reunion with the in itself, thus achieving totality by healing the fundamental rupture in being. But this totality is an impossible synthesis. As soon as the thought self would become coincident with the in itself, it would lose itself as thought self. A final totality remains forever unattainable because it would combine the incompatible characteristics of the in itself, which is positivity and plenitude, and the thought self, negativity and lack. The impossible striving for reunion gives rise to the unhappy or alienated consciousness. The thought self is sick in its being because it is haunted by a totality which it seeks to attain but never can without losing itself as thought self. I quote, "The being of human reality is suffering because it emerges in being as perpetually haunted by a totality which it is without being able to be it, since it would not be able to attain the in itself without losing itself as thought self. Human reality, therefore, is by nature an unhappy consciousness without the possibility of surpassing its unhappy state." End quote. You can see he's getting this from Hegel, really, about unhappy consciousness. Anyway, now possibility, as an immediate structure of the thought self, provides further clarification of the meaning of the thought self as lack. The possible is what the thought self lacks in its drive for completeness and totality. It indicates the not yet of human reality, the openness of its constant striving. The structures of the thought self are ontologically rooted in temporality, which provides their unifying ground. This temporality is understood in Sartre's phenomenological analysis as a synthesis of structured moments. The elements or directions of time, past, present and future, do not constitute an infinite series of nows or collected givens in which some are no longer and others are not yet. If time is understood as an infinite series of discrete nows, then the whole series is annihilated. The past nows are no longer real, the future nows are not yet real, and the present now is always slipping away, functioning only as a limit of an infinite division. In such a view, time evaporates and is dissolved into an infinite dust of instants, which are ontologically anemic. A phenomenological analysis of the time of the immediate consciousness avoids this dissolution of temporality by describing the elements of time as structured moments of an original synthesis. Following Heidegger, Sartre speaks of time as an ecstatic unity in which the past is still existentially real, the future already existentially real, and in which past and future coalesce in the present. However, Sartre differs from Heidegger in refusing to ascribe ontological priority to the future. No ecstasis of time has any priority over any of the others. None can exist without the other two. If indeed one is to accent any ecstasis, Sartre maintains that it would be phenomenologically closer to the facts to accent the present rather than the future. The past remains an integral part of my being. It is not something which I had or possessed at one time. It is something of which I am aware here and now. The past is always bound to my present. Man is always related to his past, but he is at the same time separated from it insofar as he engages in a constant movement from himself as past to himself as future. The past tends to become solidified and thus takes on the quality of an in itself. It is defined as a for itself which has become an in itself. It takes on a character of completeness and fixity, but it still remains mine, and as long as it remains a part of my consciousness, it can be recovered in an act of choice. The past provides the ontological foundation for facticity. In a very real sense, the past and ficticity indicate one and the same thing. The past makes possible my experience of abandonment and situationality. In contrast to the past, which has become an in itself, the present remains a full embodied for itself. Sartre defines the present as a perpetual flight in the face of being. It exhibits a flight from the being that it was and a flight towards the being that it will be. Strictly speaking, the for itself as present has its being outside of itself, behind it and before it. It was its past and will be its future. The for itself as present is not what it is, which is past, and is what it is not, which is future. The future is a mode of being which the for itself must strive to be. As a mode of being, it designates an existential quality which one is, rather than an abstract property which one has. The future is a lack which is constitutive of my subjectivity. As the past provides the foundation for facticity, so the future provides the foundation for possibility. The future constitutes the meaning of my present for itself as a project of possibilities. The future is not a series of chronologically ordered nows which are yet to come. Rather, it is a region of my being which circumscribes my expanding possibilities and defines me as a for itself who is always on the way. The temporalized world of the for itself is not an insulated world experienced in isolation. In the world of the for itself, the others, autrui, have already made their appearance. Hence the being of the fourth self is always a being for others as well. The discussion of the problem of the interrelation of personal selves occupies a lengthy and important part of being and nothingness. Sartre begins with an examination and criticism of the views of Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger, and then proceeds to a positive formulation of his own. The other is already disclosed in the movements of the pre-reflective, non-positional consciousness. Shame affords an example of reflective disclosure of the other, as well as a disclosure of myself as standing before the other. Through shame I discover simultaneously the other and an aspect of my being. I am ashamed of myself before the other reveals myself to me. I need the other in order to realize fully all the structures of my being. It is thus that the structures of being for itself and being for others are inseparable. In the phenomenon of the look, le regard, we find another example of the pre-reflective disclosure of the self and the other. It is through the look that the other erupts into my world, decentralizes and dissolves it, and then by reference to his own projects, reconstitutes it and the freedom which I experience. When I am looked at, the stability of my world and the freedom which I experience as for itself are threatened. The other is apprehended as one who is about to steal my world, suck me into the orbit of his concerns. It sounds more exciting than it really is, actually. But anyway, suck me into the orbit of his concerns and reduce me to the mode of being in itself, to an object or thing. Being seen by the other involves becoming an object for the other. When the movement of the look is completed, I am no longer a free subject. I have fallen into the slavery of the other. Thus being seen constitutes me as a being without defences for a freedom which is not my freedom. It is in this sense that we can consider ourselves as slaves insofar as we appear to the other. But this slavery is not the result of a life in the abstract form of consciousness. I am a slave to the degree my being is dependent at the centre of a freedom which is not mine, and which is the very condition of my being. It is in this way that the existence of the other determines my original fall, a fall which can be most generally described as a fall from myself, as being for itself into the mode of being in itself. My only defence is the objectivization of the other. Through my look I can seek to shatter the world of the other and divest him of his subjective freedom. Indeed, I seek to remove the other from my world and put him out of play. But this can never succeed because the existence of the other is a contingent and irreducible fact. I encounter the other, I do not constitute him. The other remains threatening to counterattack my defences with his look. Thus there results a constant cycle of mutual objectivization. I affirm my freedom by rendering the other into an object. Then the other affirms his freedom by rendering me into an object. Then I stage an existential counterattack and the cycle repeats itself. According to Sartre, there seems to be no end to this sort of thing. The upshot of all this is an irreconcilable conflict between the self and the other, with a consequent breakdown of all communication. Alienation has the last word in Sartre's doctrine of intersubjectivity. If you're searching for a positive doctrine of community, you'll be searching for it in vain in Sartre. All forms of being with find their common denominator in an alienating being for. In the relation of the fourth self with the other, the body appears as a central phenomenon. The body is discussed in the context of three ontological dimensions. 1. The body as I existed. 2. the body as utilized and known by the other. And 3, the body as I exist it, in reference to its being known by the other. The body as I exist it is not the objectivized body constituted by nerves, glands, muscles and organs. Such an objectivized body is present for the physician when he gives me a medical examination, but I do not apprehend my body in this way. I apprehend my body in its lived concreteness as that phenomenon which indicates my possibilities in the world. The body as concretely lived signifies a level of being which is fundamentally different from the body as objectively known. The body as concretely lived reveals an original relation to the world of immediate and practical concerns. I carry out my practical concerns through instruments or utensils. Sartre, in his development of this concept of the world, draws heavily from Heidegger and defines the world of immediate experience as an instrumental world. Instruments refer to my body insofar as the body apprehends and modifies the world through the use of instruments. My body and the world are thus coextensive. My body is spread out across the utensils which I use. My body is everywhere in the world. To have a body and to experience that there is a world are one and the same thing. However, not only do I exist my body, but my body is also utilized and known by the other. This second ontological dimension indicates my body as a body for the other, my body as known by the other, and as so also his body as known by me, is always a body in a situation. The body of the other is apprehended within the movements of a situation as a synthetic totality of life and action. The isolated appendages and gestures of another's body have no significance outside the context of a situation. A clenched fist in itself means nothing, only when the clenched fist is apprehended as an integral part of a synthetic totality of life movements is the lived body of the other disclosed. A corpse is no longer in a situation, and hence can be known only in its modality of death as an anatomical, physiological entity. The third ontological dimension indicates the reappraisal of my body as a body which is known by and exists for the other. Thus, alienation enters my world, my body becomes a tool or an object for the other, my body flows to the other who sucks it into the orbit of his projects and brings about the dissolution of my world, which is not the best way to be sucked. Anyway, this alienation is made manifest through affective structures such as shyness, which I know rather about actually. Blushing, for example, expresses the consciousness of my body, not as I live it for myself, but as I live it for the other. I cannot be embarrassed by my own body as I exist it. Only a body which exists for the other can become an occasion for embarrassment. In the concrete relation of the forward self with the other, two sets of contradictory attitudes make their appearance. On the one hand, there are attitudes of love and masochism, and on the other hand, the attitudes of hatred and sadism. In the love relationship, the beloved is for the lover not simply a thing which he desires to possess. The analogy of ownership breaks down in an explanation of love. Love expresses a special kind of appropriation. The lover wants to assimilate the love of the beloved without destroying his or her freedom, but this relationship of love ultimately founders because it is impossible to maintain an absolute subjectivity of freedom without objectivizing another as the material for one's freedom. This accounts for the insecurity of love. The lover is perpetually in danger of being made to appear as an object. In masochism, the annihilation of subjectivity is deliberately directed inward. The masochist puts himself forward as an in itself for the other. He sets up conditions so that he can be assimilated by the other. Thus he deliberately transforms himself into an object. Hatred and sadism constitute the reverse attitude. Here there is an attempt to objectify the other rather than oneself. The sadist seeks to incarnate the other by using his body as a tool. The other becomes an instrument in his hands and thus appropriates the freedom of the other. But simplest form is an attempt to appropriate the freedom of the other, but this attempt results in failure because the other can always turn back upon the sadist and make an object out of him. Thus again the reader is made aware of the futility of all attempts to establish harmonious relations with the other. This inability to achieve genuine communication leads to a despair in which nothing remains for the forward self but to become involved in the circularity of objectivization in which it passes from one to the other of the two fundamental attitudes. Sartre concludes his phenomenological essay with a restatement and further elucidation of the nature and quality of human freedom, and a delineation of his program of existential psychoanalysis. Freedom is discussed in relation to the will, in relation to facticity, and finally in relation to responsibility. The will can never be the condition of freedom, it is simply a psychological manifestation of it. The will presupposes the foundation of an original freedom in order to be able to constitute itself as will. The will is derived or posited by reflective decision. It is a psychological manifestation which emerges within the complex of motives and ends already posited by the forward self. Properly speaking, it is not the will that is free, man is free. The will is simply a manifestation of man's primordial freedom. Freedom in relation to facticity gives rise to the situation. The situation is that ambiguous phenomenon in which it is impossible clearly to distinguish the contribution of freedom and the determinants of brute circumstance. This accounts for the paradox of freedom. There is freedom only in a situation, and there is a situation only through freedom. Sartre delineates 5 structures of the situation in which freedom and facticity interpenetrate each other. 1. My place. 2. My past. 3. My environment. 4. My fellow man. 5. My death. Insofar as freedom always interpenetrates facticity, man becomes wholly responsible for himself. I am responsible for everything except for the fact of my responsibility. I am free, but I am not free to obliterate fully my freedom. I am condemned to be free. This abandonment to freedom is an expression of my facticity. Yet I must assume responsibility for the fact that my facticity is incomprehensible and contingent. The result is that my facticity or my final abandonment consists simply in the fact that I am condemned to be wholly responsible for myself. Although freedom and facticity interpenetrate, it remains incontestable that freedom is given a privileged status in the Sartrean view of man. The touchstone of existential psychoanalysis is a concentration of man's fundamental project, projet fondamental. This fundamental project is neither Heidegger's Sein zum Tode, nor is it Freud's libidinous cathexis. The method of existential psychoanalysis resembles that of the Freudians in that an effort is made to work back through secondary and superficial manifestations of personality to an ultimate and primary project, but the existentialist differs with Freud concerning the nature of this project. The Freudian localizes the project in a libidinal attachment which is determined by the past history of the self. The existential psychoanalyst broadens the framework of explanation to include the future projects of the self as well. The fundamental project is thus understood in the context of man's temporalized being, which includes the ecstatic unity of past, present and future. The irreducible minimum of this fundamental project is the desire to be. Quite clearly, it is impossible to advance farther than being, but in having advanced thus far, one has undercut the simple empirical determinants of behaviour. The goal of this desire to be is to attain the impermeability, solidity, and infinite density of the in itself. The ideal toward which consciousness strives is to be the foundation of its own being. It strives to become an in itself for itself, an ideal which can properly be defined as God. One can thus most simply express the fundamental project of man as the desire to be God, but the idea of God is contradictory, for in striving after this ideal, the self can only lose itself, as for itself. Man's fundamental desire to give birth to God results in failure. He must thus reconcile himself to the fact that his is a useless passion.